Evelyn Parker had thought the worst part of tonight would be singing to a nearly empty bar. She was wrong. When she refused the wrong man, he returned with 2 others to teach her a lesson. They dragged her into a dark alley, shattered her ankle, and left her bleeding in the cold night. Evelyn begged the shadow moving toward her not to hurt her anymore, but Declan Hayes had not come to hurt her. The Italian crime boss, owner of the nightclub where she sang, had come to destroy every man who had laid a hand on her. It was close to 2 a.m. in New Orleans. The Velvet Note, a cozy jazz bar tucked away in the old French Quarter, had only a few late drinkers left, lingering over their last sips of bourbon. On the small wooden stage, Evelyn Parker stood alone, an old microphone in her hand, her quiet voice drifting through the smoky air like mist, echoing faintly with the sorrow of Billie Holiday. She had sung here for 8 months, 5 nights a week, always the last to leave the stage, carrying home a dream that never felt close enough to touch. Each time she counted her tips after a show, her heart tightened when the total fell short of the rent and the tuition for the vocal class she longed to attend. Tonight she earned only $23. When the old clock behind the bar struck 1:45, the last customer rose, paid, and slipped out into the night. Evelyn gathered her money, pulled on her coat, thanked the bartender, and stepped outside. The November wind swept against her collar, sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of the Mississippi River and the greasy smell of fried food from a late-night vendor parked nearby. Her apartment was only 6 blocks away. She had walked this route hundreds of times and never had any reason to be afraid, but tonight felt different. As she turned onto a narrow, empty street, she heard footsteps behind her. Quick, urgent, more than one pair. Evelyn's hand slipped into her coat pocket, brushing her phone. Man's voice came from behind, cold and familiar. "There she is. Thought you could humiliate me and walk away, huh?" She turned. 3 men. The one in the middle she recognized instantly: Bradley Westbrook Jr., 32 years old, the son of a state senator, a spoiled heir of the political elite. 3 weeks earlier, he had tried to flirt with her at the bar, spewing crude words and ignoring her refusals. Evelyn had raised her voice and told him to leave, right there in front of his friends. He had walked out, face flushed with rage. She should have known he would come back. "I don't want trouble," Evelyn said, keeping her voice steady, her hand still gripping her phone. "I just want to go home. You made a fool of me." Bradley stepped closer, his breath heavy with alcohol and arrogance. "You think you're better than me? I think I have the right to say no." Evelyn took a step back. The other 2 men fanned out, blocking her path. "Wrong answer." Bradley's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist and twisting it hard. Evelyn screamed, tore free, and ran. She managed only a few yards before she was yanked backward. Rough hands ripped her coat, a fist slammed into her face, and the world went black around the edges. They dragged her into a narrow alley reeking of garbage and broken glass. She screamed, kicked, begged, but the only reply was laughter and blows. Bradley's shoe came down on her foot with a sickening crack. Evelyn screamed until her voice broke. Her ankle was snapped, the pain so blinding she could feel nothing else but terror and disbelief. They beat her until she could no longer move, then left her there on the cold cement, writhing in agony, blood trickling from her mouth, her ankle swollen grotesquely, her phone shattered beside her. She thought she would die there alone, in the dark, for daring to say no to the wrong man. But then came another sound of footsteps, heavier, slower. Evelyn tried to open her eyes, her vision blurred with tears and blood. A figure approached, tall and broad-shouldered. She whispered, her voice no more than a fading breath. "Please. I can't walk. Don't hurt me anymore." The shadow stopped. It knelt beside her. A hand, surprisingly gentle, lifted her face. The dim yellow light from the street lamp revealed the man's features. His dark blue eyes widened in horror as he recognized her. "Evelyn." His voice was hoarse with anger, with shock. "God, what happened to you?" She knew that face. She had seen him many times at the bar, sitting quietly at the back, listening as she sang. The man who never spoke but whose gaze never left her. Declan Hayes, owner of the Velvet Note, a name people mentioned only in whispers, wrapped in fear and respect. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak. 3 men, Bradley, he. But the words would not form. Declan's eyes swept over her bruised, broken body, his expression darkening into something cold and terrible. His breath came heavy. "I'm taking you to a doctor right now. Hold on. It's going to hurt." He lifted her in his arms, careful as though she might shatter. Evelyn cried out in pain and let her head fall against his shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing but the warmth of the man carrying her. She should have been afraid. But all she felt was gratitude that someone had come, that someone cared enough to help her, and that someone was Declan Hayes, the man everyone feared, the man who would soon make those 3 names the last anyone would dare to speak. If you have listened this far, thank you for sharing your time and your heart with us through every pulse of this story. And if something within you feels tight, stirred, or aching, perhaps you understand Evelyn, someone who once believed that good things were never meant for her until they arrived unannounced and full of grace. Do not forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this story with those you love, so that we may continue telling moments that reach the deepest corners of emotion, stories of lives, of turning points, of truth disguised as fiction yet filled with meaning. Where are you listening from tonight? Tell us the city, the state, or the country where you are, so we may know how far the story of Evelyn and Declan has traveled, how many streets it has crossed, how many hearts in need of healing it has found, hearts like yours. Thank you for being here, and we hope you will stay with us for what comes next. Declan's arms tightened around Evelyn as he carried her out of the alley, his steps heavy against the hiss of the midnight wind and the dim glow of streetlights that fell across the cold concrete. She no longer had the strength to ask where he was taking her. The pain coursing through her body blurred into one endless ache, part fear, part wound. Declan's face was still, but in those deep blue eyes burned a fury so quiet and consuming that he did not need to speak. The very air around him seemed to thicken with it. He crossed 2 blocks, the echo of his black leather shoes steady on the worn brick pavement of the French Quarter. A black SUV waited before an unmarked building. The driver, dressed in a dark suit, opened the rear door without being told. Declan gently placed Evelyn on the seat, draped his coat over her trembling body, and climbed in beside her without a single word. The car moved through the stillness of the night, turning into a narrow street where a 3-story building stood, its brass nameplate bearing the name of a doctor few had ever heard of. Declan carried her inside, and within minutes a middle-aged man with a stern face appeared. He asked no questions, only glanced briefly at Evelyn before nodding at Declan, as if long accustomed to emergencies that required silence more than inquiry. Evelyn was laid on a bed in a small white room that smelled sharply of antiseptic. She could barely open her eyes. The ceiling above her swam in and out of focus, cold and pain and panic twisting together like a storm with no exit. The doctor examined her injuries one by one. A severely broken ankle, 3 cracked ribs, deep bruises along her hip and abdomen, a torn corner of her mouth, and dark marks circling her neck and arms. He injected her with a strong dose of painkiller, and within moments the world began to fade, growing lighter, quieter, as if she were drifting away from herself. But before she slipped fully into the haze of sleep, she turned her head and saw Declan still standing there, silent as stone, his dark eyes heavy with a storm waiting to break. When Evelyn awoke, dawn had begun to seep through the curtains. The first light of day poured across the ceiling in a soft wash of amber. She was lying in a warm room with clean white sheets, soft pillows, and a folded blanket that smelled faintly of linen. Her ankle was secured in a brace, her ribs wrapped in bandages, a drip line feeding into her left arm. The air was so still it felt fragile, until she heard the scrape of a chair beside the bed. Declan sat there, still in the same suit from the night before, his shirt collar undone, his hair slightly tousled. He watched her without speaking, leaning forward a little. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and raw. He reached for the glass of water on the table and handed it to her. Evelyn took a few sips, then looked at him for a long time. "You stayed here all night?" Her voice was hoarse. Declan nodded, his gaze softening though tension lingered beneath the calm. "The doctor said you slept almost 8 hours. The painkillers were strong." She gripped the edge of the blanket, forcing herself to remember. The flashes came back in fragments, the laughter of 3 men, the reek of alcohol, the sound of bone snapping, her own scream breaking into silence. The images were blurred and warped but sharp enough to make her body tremble. "It was Bradley Westbrook," she whispered, steadying, her breath. "With 2 others. I don't know their names, but I remember their faces." Declan said nothing for a few seconds. Then he rose, walked to the window, and looked outside. The room fell into deep silence, filled only with the wild thudding of her heartbeat. "When I heard you scream," he said finally, his voice low, rough. "I was at the corner, 3 buildings away. I never take that route home, but last night I was walking after a meeting, planning to hear your last song before leaving." He turned back, his eyes burning with a restrained fire. "I heard you call out, and I ran." Evelyn looked at him, her chest tightening. She didn't know how to thank him enough. "You saved me," she whispered. "If you hadn't been there." Declan stepped closer and sat at the edge of the bed. He took her hand in his, rough fingers closing around hers with surprising gentleness. "Evelyn, what happened last night cannot be left unanswered. You're under my roof. You sing in my bar. That means you're under my protection. And I don't let anyone touch what's mine without paying for it." Her heart clenched, torn between fear and something dangerously close to gratitude. Fear, because she knew who he was. Gratitude, because he hadn't turned away. And she understood, in the moment he lifted her from that dark pavement, that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Declan Hayes asked no questions as Evelyn told him what had happened, and he didn't interrupt even once during the 10 long minutes it took for her to gather the fragments of memory and recount every cruel thing the 3 men had done to her in that alley. At times she faltered, her voice cracking. At others the tears came unbidden, slipping down her cheeks before she could stop them. Yet Declan's eyes never left her. There was no pity in them, only focus, pure and absolute, as if every word she spoke was a piece of a puzzle he was determined to complete. When she said the name Bradley Westbrook, he froze. A shadow passed through the deep blue of his eyes, and the hand resting on his thigh curled slowly into a fist. Still, he said nothing. He simply placed his hand over hers, firm and steady, a silent promise beneath his touch. When she finished, the space between them thickened, charged like the edge of a storm waiting to strike. Declan stood and moved toward the window, where the early sky was turning gold with the rise of the sun. Evelyn didn't know what he was thinking, nor did she dare to ask. All she knew was that this man who had barely spoken 3 sentences to her in 8 months had been the only one there when she thought she would die alone in the dark, and that changed everything. When Declan turned back to her, the softness in his expression was gone. His face had hardened, his voice low, firm, and edged with an icy resolve. "Bradley is the son of a state senator, isn't he?" Evelyn nodded faintly. "And he thinks that name of his is a shield no one can break." Declan pulled his phone from his pocket, typed a short message, then slipped it away. "I'll find the other 2. It may take a day, but I have people." Evelyn felt a chill run through her. Not fear of him, but of the quiet fury gathering within him, a kind of anger that needed no shouting, no violence, only certainty. The anger of a man who understood power and knew exactly how to use it to protect what he claimed as his own. "Declan," she whispered, her voice carrying both warning and plea. "If you go after him, his family could cause you trouble. They have power." He turned to her, and for an instant his gaze softened, though not a trace of hesitation touched it. "I don't care. Do you think I've survived this long by letting men like him do whatever they please?" Evelyn said nothing. In the depths of his eyes she saw something dark and haunted, the shadow of a man who had once failed to protect someone and had never forgiven himself for it. She still did not understand why he had appeared at that exact moment, why this man whom she had only known through his quiet presence at the back of the barhad lifted her out of that hellish alley and stayed by her side for 12 hours straight. She looked at him for a long time. "Why me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Declan walked closer and sat beside her. "The first time I saw you sing was on a rainy night. You were performing an Etta James song. There were only 5 people in the room, but your voice kept me still for 4 whole minutes." He gave a faint smile, not one of joy but of melancholy. "You reminded me of my mother. She sang jazz too, before everything fell apart." He paused, his gaze dropping to his hands, where old scars traced across calloused fingers. "After that I came every week, always sitting in the last row, never speaking. I just listened to remember that something in this world could still be beautiful." Evelyn swallowed hard, unable to find words. The story was too personal, too raw. "And last night," he went on quietly, "I heard you call out. You said, 'Please, I can't walk, and I ran, not because I'm a good man, but because I once heard the same scream from my sister. And when I got there, it was already too late. Evelyn's throat closed. Declan looked at her, his eyes darkened again, but this time with pain instead of anger. I can't go back and save my sister, but I saved you. She reached out and touched his hand, no longer afraid. I know, she whispered, and I'll never forget. In that moment, with the morning light spilling through the curtains and silence thick with feeling, Evelyn understood one thing. This man with his shadows and his untold stories was the reason she had survived that night. And perhaps he too was being saved in a way he had yet to recognize. When Evelyn awoke for the second time since that terrible night, she was no longer in the clinic. The room was larger, quieter, and marked by an understated elegance. Soft light filtered through white curtains onto pale gray walls, high ceilings, and warm wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of polished oak and coffee. She lay on a wide bed, dressed in crisp white sheets, thick pillows, and a blanket so soft it felt unreal. Beside the bed stood a low walnut table holding a vase of white daisies, a tea tray, and a thick book left open midway. She tried to sit up, but a wave of pain surged through her hip and leg, forcing her to exhale sharply. Her ankle was still secured in its brace, her left side still aching with every breath. She was wearing a soft cotton shirt and loose sweatpants, not hospital clothes. Someone had changed her, carefully and gently. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway. Moments later, the door opened, and Declan entered, carrying a tray with porridge, a glass of water, and a few pills. Today he was dressed more, simply white shirt with sleeves rolled, dark trousers, but the calm authority in his movements remained unchanged. He stopped beside the bed, his eyes flicking quickly over her face. You're awake. Good. Evelyn blinked. Where am I? Her voice was still rough but steadier. Declan set the tray on the table and sat down beside her. My apartment, top floor of a building in the warehouse district. He poured her a glass of water and handed it to her. I didn't want to leave you alone at the clinic. Here it's easier for me to look after you. Evelyn took the glass, her hand trembling slightly. You brought me to your home? He nodded. This place is safe. My men are downstairs. Private elevator. No one can find you here unless I allow it. The way he said it made her shiver, not from fear, but from the certainty in his voice. It wasn't just safety he was talking about. It was fortification, a fortress in which he was keeping her protected. Declan placed the pills in her hand. Painkillers. Take them after you eat. He helped her sit up, adjusting the pillows so her back rested comfortably. Evelyn leaned into them, taking the spoon he offered, unsure what to say. She had always thought of Declan Hayes as a distant, cold man, one who cared only for money and power. Yet now the man sitting before her was nothing like that image. He fed her the porridge as though it were the most natural thing in the world, without impatience or discomfort. From time to time, he stopped to wipe her mouth with a tissue, his eyes focused entirely on her, as if she were the only thing in the room that mattered. You've slept nearly a full day, he said softly. Your body needs time to heal. The doctor will come here tomorrow to check on you. Evelyn swallowed another spoonful of porridge, caught between gratitude and confusion. You don't have to do all of this. I could hire a nurse or... He shook his head, cutting her off. I'm not doing this out of obligation. I'm doing it because I want to. You're not a guest. You're someone under my protection. And once I take responsibility for someone, I don't hand that over to anyone else. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't threatening, but it carried a weight that silenced her. She looked at him for a long moment before whispering, I'm not used to anyone caring about me like this. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. Then start getting used to it. The simplicity of the words made her chest tighten. After everything she had endured, this kindness unsettled her more than pain ever could. When she finished eating, Declan helped her lie back down, set the glass of water within reach, and pulled the blanket up to her chest. Before standing, he paused, sitting on the edge of the bed, his eyes gentle but firm. Evelyn, from now on I want you to focus on one thing only: rest and recovery. Don't worry about rent. Don't worry about work. Don't worry about who will pay for what happened. I'll handle it. She bit her lip. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he said instantly. But if you feel that way, think of it as giving me a chance to do the right thing this time. Evelyn closed her eyes, unable to answer. Her heart felt lighter and heavier all at once. This man hadn't just saved her from dying. He was trying to save the part of her that had long stopped believing in goodness. And that, to her, was harder to accept than the wounds themselves. Because if she let herself trust him, she knew her heart would have no way back. 3 days later, Evelyn could sit up without needing full support. She still couldn't walk. Her ankle remained swollen and sore, but with the crutch Declan had placed beside her bed, she managed to take small, tentative steps. Every morning he brought her coffee exactly the way she liked Ithalf milk, no sugar, hot but not boiling. Breakfast was always ready on the table by the sofa, where she could sit and gaze through the wide balcony overlooking the old quarter, the winding river in the distance, and the moss-covered rooftops that made New Orleans at sunrise look like a living painting. The air between them grew easier with each passing day. Evelyn no longer felt awkward in his presence, and Declan seemed less guarded, less taut with unspoken tension. He never asked about the things she wasn't ready to share. Instead, he spoke of gentler things: the weather, music, the jazz artists he had once booked at the bar. His favorite foods, as though conversation itself were an act of healing. Yet beneath the calm surface, Evelyn sensed there was something he kept buried, a fracture invisible to others, but she knew it was there. One windy afternoon, when the sunlight slanted across the floor in moving patterns, she sat curled in an armchair, a book in her hands but her eyes fixed on Declan standing out on the balcony. The light caught the strands of silver at his temples and the hard lines of his face. "Do you ever think maybe I wasn't worth saving?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, freezing them both. Declan turned, closed the glass door behind him, and quietly took the chair across from her. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, steady and unflinching. "No one is beyond saving," he said slowly. "But I understand why you feel that way, because I've felt it too." Evelyn looked up, startled by the confession. He was silent for a moment, weighing something inside him. Then his voice came lower, rougher. 8 years ago, my sister was abducted by 3 men right in front of a restaurant. She was 27, had just finished her master's degree. She was supposed to fly to Italy for school. I told her to wait for me to pick her up, but I was 12 minutes late. He exhaled, his eyes unfocused, as if time itself had pulled him backward. In those 12 minutes, they did the unthinkable. And when I arrived, it was already over. Evelyn's throat tightened. There were no words she could offer. Declan continued, slow but steady. Francesca survived. But she wasn't the same girl anymore. It took 3 years of therapy, 2 stays in psychiatric hospitals, and more nights than I can count sitting outside emergency rooms waiting for her to wake up. A faint, bitter smile crossed his face. And what I can't forgive myself for is that I had everything: money, power, people to stop it from happening. But I wasn't there. Not when it mattered. Evelyn stayed silent for a long time. Her heart pounded against her ribs as if each beat might break through. "And that's why you saved me?" she asked, not with doubt, but with the need to understand. Declan nodded, unapologetic. "When I heard you scream, I didn't think. I just ran, because this time, I was still in time." He looked at her, and in that moment he was no longer the wealthy bar owner or the powerful man everyone feared, but an older brother, a man once helpless, now trying to redeem himself through a second chance. "I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I can promise you one thing: no one will ever touch you again, not while I'm alive." Evelyn turned away so he wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. She understood now, and she could feel herself changing. Perhaps since that night, the only thing keeping her anchored was the quiet, unwavering presence of the man before her. A man who carried darkness within him, yet was somehow the only place she felt safe, and that, to her, was enough to believe that maybe she could start again. Later that night, Declan appeared in her doorway while she was reading in bed, the soft lamplight casting a golden glow across her face. He stood still for a few seconds, one hand in his pocket, his voice low and calm. "Would you like to get some air?" "Not far, just the rooftop." Evelyn looked up, surprised. Since arriving here, she had never stepped beyond this apartment. Their entire world had been the bed, the sofa, the small kitchen, and the balcony overlooking the old quarter. "Is it safe?" she asked, half cautious, half afraid of being seen. Declan nodded. No one can come up but me. You'll like it. There are string lights, soft chairs, and a view worth seeing." She hesitated, then nodded. "Give me 5 minutes." When she wheeled herself to the door, Declan was already waiting, a light jacket in one hand, a thin wool scarf in the other. He said nothing, simply draped the scarf around her shoulders, adjusting it gently so the wind wouldn't sneak down her collar. They took the elevator up. When the doors opened, the sight stole her breath. Tiny amber lights stretched from the awning to each corner of the terrace, their glow spilling over rows of green plants along the railing. A pair of outdoor sofas, upholstered in pale gray fabric, framed a weathered wooden table on which sat 2 glasses of wine, a pitcher of water, and a plate of small cookies. Beyond, the city of New Orleans shimmered like an earthly constellation, lights dancing across the surface of the Mississippi, and the night wind was just enough to make it feel as though they had stepped outside of time itself. Declan wheeled her close to the railing, then sat beside her. He poured wine, handing her a glass. Evelyn held it with both hands, letting the warmth of the glass seep into her cold palms. "This place is beautiful," she murmured, her eyes on the city. Declan nodded, leaning back slightly. "I come here when I can't sleep, or when I need to think. It's quiet here, but never lonely." Evelyn understood that feeling. Not everyone could find a place that was peaceful without feeling abandoned. "When I first came to New Orleans," she said, half smiling, half wistful, "I used to dream of living somewhere like this. But the reality was a cramped, studio apartment with damp walls, dreams hanging by a thread, and rent always higher than whatever I could make." Declan didn't interrupt. He only listened. His voice softened. "But you still sang. Still stood on that stage every night. Still poured your soul into every note." She turned toward him. "How do you know that?" He smiled faintly. "Because I was listening. For 8 months. I didn't go to that bar for business, Evelyn. I went for you." The words caught her off guard, her heart skipping a beat. She looked at him, but his face didn't change. It wasn't flirtation, no manipulation, just truth, spoken simply. "Once," he continued, his voice lowering like the last hum of a saxophone at the end of a song, "you sang, 'Someone to watch over me.' I remember because it was raining hard that night. You wore a blue dress, your hair pinned up, and the stage lights reflected in your eyes as if you were crying. Your voice wasn't perfect, but there was something in it that made people hold their breath to listen." Evelyn turned away, her eyes stinging. "That night I was losing hope. Singing was the only way to hold on to some part of myself." "I know," Declan said softly, "and that's why I couldn't walk away when I heard you call for help. Because you're the one who reminded me that beauty still exists. I owe you for that." She didn't know what to say. For a moment, everything around them went still. She set her glass down and turned to face him. "Thank you. For being there. For not leaving like everyone else did." Declan leaned closer, his eyes meeting hers, not rushing, not demanding, just steady and quiet. "I'll never leave." Neither of them spoke again. The wind brushed through her hair. Under the soft, golden light, they sat side by side, while the city below whispered and shimmered. In his eyes was an unspoken promise. And in her heart, something softened, something opened. Amid all the wreckage, something new was, forming, uncertain, but real. And for the first time in weeks, Evelyn believed she could trust someone. Not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her long before she even realized she had begun to disappear. Declan remained beside her on the rooftop, the amber light weaving through his salt and pepper hair, casting his shadow across the old brick floor, like a still portrait framed against the murmuring city below. Evelyn glanced at him, her heartbeat quickening not from fear but from the strange calm that came with his silence. The way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world, and for the first time she did not feel lost. A soft breeze drifted past, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby pot, and when Evelyn shivered, Declan immediately leaned closer, adjusting her scarf, his fingers brushing her cheek with a warmth that stole her breath. They said nothing for several minutes. They didn't need to. Between them stretched a quiet understanding, where every feeling existed without the need for words. Evelyn tilted her head, her gaze meeting his, deep and steady. She saw herself reflected in those eyes, small, fragile, but seen in a light that made her feel stronger than she had ever been before. "I used to think," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper in the wind, that I would never be able to trust anyone again. Declan didn't look away. He only watched her. I know, he replied. And I don't need you to trust me yet. I just need you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Evelyn bit her lip, torn inside. Not because she didn't want to believe him, but because she was afraid that if she let herself believe again, everything would shatter like it once had. But Declan never pushed her to choose. He was simply there. No grand promises, only quiet actions. When she had been left alone in the dark, he had been the one who stepped into it without hesitation. And now, he was still here, unmoving. She reached out and gently placed her hand over his, resting on his knee. He glanced down at her hand, then back into her eyes, as if waiting for a sign. Evelyn said nothing. She only leaned forward slightly, just enough, and when he leaned toward her too, the distance between them vanished into a single breath. The first kiss was neither urgent nor fierce. It was a soft meeting of two people who had both been broken, finding fragments of themselves in each other's warmth. His lips were tender, careful, as though she were something fragile and precious. His hand rose to her cheek, his fingertips tracing the sharp line of her jaw as if memorizing something he thought he had lost forever. Evelyn trembled but didn't pull away. She returned the kiss with a trust she hadn't given anyone in years. When they finally drew apart, both breathed softly, as if waking from a dream. Declan still held her face in his hands, his forehead resting against hers. "I'll protect you," he whispered, his voice rough with the weight of emotion long kept inside. "Not because you're weak, but because I want to be there when you're strong again. I don't need you to rely on me. I just want you to know that if you fall, I'll be there, every time." Evelyn closed her eyes. That promise was not a chain. It was a place to rest in if she needed it, a refuge without demand or condition. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she lifted her hand and touched his chest, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his heart, and he understood. They sat there together beneath the night sky of New Orleans, where the stars were dimmed by city lights but still existed, still shimmered if one knew how to look for them. So were they two people marked by scars, sitting not to forget what they had lost, but to believe that they could begin again, slowly, gently, and truthfully. The first kiss didn't change the world, but it opened a small door, one through which hope could touch the light. And in that light, Evelyn knew she had allowed herself to believe once more not in love, but in a person. A man named Declan Hayes. The next morning, Evelyn awoke to sunlight spilling softly through the curtains, the wool scarf from the night before still draped across her shoulders. Declan was no longer in the room, but the faint warmth left in the chair beside her bed told her he had stayed there through the night, guarding her sleep. Her ankle was still weak, but the pain had eased, soothed by medication and careful rest. Declan's private doctor arrived at noon, nodding with quiet satisfaction, after watching her take a few slow, steady steps with assistance. He said she could start walking with crutches, as long as she moved slowly and had someone nearby. Declan stood beside her, arms crossed, his gaze intent but carrying a trace of restrained relief. When the doctor left, he turned toward her, a small smile curving his lips. "Good. Ready for a small challenge?" Evelyn blinked. "What kind of challenge?" Declan walked over, retrieving the pair of sleek crutches standing by the door, and placed them in front of her. "Shopping," she laughed, for the first time in days. "You're kidding." "I never kid," he said, a faint spark of mischief lighting his eyes. "You need clothes, shoes, everything. You can't keep wearing hospital pajamas and my shirts forever." Evelyn glanced down at the soft clothes she was wearing, comfortable, perfectly chosen, but not quite hers. "I don't have much money," she murmured hesitantly. Declan paused, then sat beside her, his tone low and firm. "I didn't ask if you had money. I asked if you needed something. This isn't charity, Evelyn. This is me wanting to do something for you. Don't refuse me." She looked at him, ready to protest, but stopped and simply nodded. Maybe this time, she needed to learn how to let herself receive. The black SUV carried them to a quiet boutique nestled on a splay, a leafy street in the Garden District. The staff clearly knew Declan. They asked no questions, only smiled politely, offering Evelyn a velvet chair, a glass of water with lemon, and a series of carefully chosen outfits. Declan never strayed far, yet he didn't interfere. He simply observed, nodding occasionally when she stepped out in a pale sea-green dress or a long cream coat that framed her small figure. At first Evelyn felt awkward, uncertain, but gradually she began to smile more, her eyes brightening with a spark of life she hadn't realized was missing. When she emerged in a simple black midi dress with a modest V neckline, Declan stood, walked toward her, and for a moment it felt as if the entire room vanished. "That one suits you," he said softly. "It makes you look like yourself again. Not a victim. A woman who knows who she is." Evelyn felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the strange, quiet power of being seen. Truly seen. When they left the boutique, Evelyn carried 3 large bags and a smile that hadn't yet faded. Declan helped her into the car, adjusted her crutches so she could sit comfortably, then slid into the seat beside her. On the way back, they spoke little, letting the soft jazz from the speakers and the whisper of wind against the windows fill the silence. But between them lingered a new kind of connection, not between the rescued and the rescuer, but between two people slowly finding each other through the smallest, most ordinary moments. When the car pulled into the underground garage, Declan turned to her and gently took her hand. "Today wasn't about the things you bought. It was about you. You stepped outside, faced the light, faced yourself. And I'm proud of you." Evelyn looked at him, her heart swelling with something warm and tight all at once. She squeezed his hand lightly, then whispered, "I'm proud too, that I had the courage to walk beside you." Declan didn't speak, but the slow nod and the look in his eyes told her enough. He would be there no matter how long or hard the road ahead, and this time, she wouldn't have to walk it alone. 3 days after that first shopping trip, Evelyn sat before the tall mirror in her bedroom, her fingers brushing through the soft waves of hair freshly curled around her shoulders. She wore a cream-colored wrap dress that traced her figure, now steadier after weeks of recovery. Her ankle was still braced, but she could stand for several minutes on her own with the help of crutches, and today, she needed that strength. Today wasn't an ordinary day. Today, she would sing. Not at the Velvet Note, not before the half-distracted patrons sipping their late-night drinks, but before the artistic board of a renowned jazz club in the heart of the French Quarter, the same stage that had once belonged to the legends of New Orleans. The man who had arranged the audition was Declan. She had found out only 2 mornings earlier when he placed an envelope in front of her containing an official invitation, signed and sealed. "They're looking for a singer to open the new season," he'd said, as if it were nothing at all. "I sent them your recording. They want to hear you live." Evelyn had stared at the letter for a long time before looking up at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because your voice doesn't belong inside 4 walls," he answered, his tone certain. "You survived, Evelyn. You stepped out of the dark. Now it's time the light finds you." Now, sitting beside him in the car, her hands felt cold with nerves. He reached over and clasped one, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Breathe. You don't have to prove anything. Just do what you always do, tell your story through your voice." Evelyn nodded, her heart restless but alive. She had once thought dreams like standing on a grand stage were impossible, almost foolish. But now, as the SUV glided through the glowing streets of New Orleans, that dream no longer felt distant. It was right there, waiting. The audition room was on the 3rd floor of a historic red brick building with high glass windows. When Declan helped her out of the car, his eyes were steady and sure, filled with a quiet protectiveness that said, without words, that no matter what happened, she wouldn't face it alone. Inside, the room was spacious and softly lit. A piano stood to the left of the small stage. 3 people sat in the front row. An older woman with silver hair and glasses, an Asian man in a dark brown suit, and a younger black man flipping through her file. Evelyn stood at the center of the stage, her hands gripping her crutch, drawing in a deep breath. The younger man looked up and smiled slightly. "Miss Parker, whenever you're ready." She nodded and signaled to the pianist. The song she chose was one she had sung hundreds of times at last. Not to impress, but because it had carried her through the darkest nights. She needed to remember why she had begun. The first notes floated through the air, and when she began to sing, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every word, every tremor in her voice, carried a piece of what she had survived: pain, fear, resilience, and that fragile thread of hope that had kept her alive. She wasn't trying to be perfect. She was simply telling the truth. When the final note faded, silence followed for several seconds. Then the silver-haired woman spoke first. "I don't know what you've been through," she said softly, "but I know you've lived it, and your voice gave me chills." The man in the brown suit nodded. "Your voice has depth, something you can't learn. It only comes from those who've lost and overcome." The third man smiled. "We'll be in touch very soon. But personally, I think we've just found our opening act." Evelyn didn't reply. She only smiled, her lips trembling, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. When she stepped off the stage, Declan was already waiting near the door. He didn't speak, only offered his hand. As they reached the car, he opened the door, helped her inside, then looked at her for a long moment. "I told you," he said with a quiet grin. "You're not just a singer, you're the story people need to hear." Evelyn looked back at him, her eyes glistening. "I don't think I could have done it without you." "You always could," he said. "I just turned the light back on." She leaned her head against the seat, her heart swelling with emotion. The audition wasn't just the beginning of a career. It was the threshold of another life, a life she had chosen not to live in fear, not in darkness, but in the open, where her voice could finally be heard. And this time, it was her own voice, the one that had almost been silenced forever. A week after the audition, Evelyn stood behind the curtain of the largest stage she had ever dreamed of. The La Lumière Jazz Club, nestled in the heart of the French Quarter, was legendary for its vibrant nights and for the long line of artists who had once begun their journeys there, a list as rich as a vinyl record of jazz history itself. This time, her name appeared at the very end of the performance Bill knew, but introduced with respect. Evelyn Parker, the woman whose voice could silence a room. They called her a singer reborn after tragedy, but only Declan knew the truth hidden beneath the silk gown she wore that night. The black dress traced her slender frame, the soft fabric gliding over collarbones and shoulders that had once borne the weight of survival. Evelyn stared at her reflection in the tall mirror backstage, one hand resting gently at her throat as if to remind herself that the voice was still there, that tonight she would let it live again. Declan approached, his perfectly tailored black suit cutting sharply through the backstage crowd, yet his eyes found only her, as though everything else had faded to gray. He said nothing, only extended his hand. Evelyn took it, her palm cold, and he didn't let go. His fingers tightened around hers, just enough to say without words, "I'm here, always." When the announcer spoke her name, the lights in the hall dimmed, and the murmur of the audience fell into breathless silence. Evelyn walked out, one step at a time on still healing legs, her posture straight, her presence quiet but commanding. The silver microphone gleamed beneath the spotlight. The intro began. Her opening song was "Someone to Watch Over Me." It wasn't the safe choice, but it was the only one that carried everything she wanted to say. When she began to sing, a stillness rippled through the room, not of surprise, but of recognition, as though every soul there had brushed against something tender and forgotten. Her voice was no longer the youthful tone captured in old recordings. Now, every note carried traces of tears, of pain endured, and of gratitude for the man sitting in the front row, his eyes never leaving her. With each phrase, she told her story not through words, but through a resonance that only a heart once broken could truly understand. The second song, then the third, drifted by like a dream. Evelyn barely looked at the crowd, glancing only occasionally toward the front row where Declan sat, silent and proud. Whenever her voice trembled, he smiled. Whenever she hesitated, he nodded once, calm and sure. It was enough. The night ended with "At Last," the song that had carried her through fear and brought her here. When the final note dissolved, the room held its breath for one long beat before the applause burst forth. It wasn't polite applause. It was recognition. It was warmth. It was a welcome back to a world she had once believed forever lost. She bowed, tears blurring her vision. As she stepped off the stage, the first person she saw was Declan. He was waiting, wordless. Evelyn went straight into his arms, not caring about her makeup or the cameras flashing. In the distance, "I did it," she whispered against his shoulder, her voice breaking. "You said I would and I did." Declan pulled her close, his voice low and steady. "You did better than that. You didn't just sing, Evelyn. You came alive. And there's nothing more beautiful than that." She drew back, looking up at him through a shimmer of tears. "Thank you, for everything, for believing in me, for staying." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "I'll always be here. Every time you sing, I'll be the first to listen." Evelyn smiled, for the first time in years unburdened by fear. That first performance wasn't just a concert. It was beginning a new chapter of a life rebuilt through music, but sustained by love. That night, as they drove back to the penthouse, the city of New Orleans still shimmered beneath them, alive with lights, laughter, and distant music. Yet inside the car, there was only quiet anticipation. Evelyn leaned her head back against the seat. She was still in her stage gown, her hair slightly tousled, her eyes bright, her lips curved in a soft, lingering smile born of the night's triumph. Declan said nothing on the way home. His hand rested lightly on her leg, not possessive, not demandingly, a silent reminder that he was there, listening even to the emotions she could not yet name. When the car stopped under the familiar building, Declan stepped out, walked around, and opened the door for her, offering his hand the same way he had the night they first met in that dark alley. But this time, when Evelyn placed her hand in his, she held on tighter, not for balance, but for closeness. They entered the elevator without a word. Only the quiet rhythm of their hearts filled the spaces, synchronized, steady, and trembling with something unspoken. When the door to the apartment opened, Declan switched on the light. The warm golden glow fell softly across the wooden floor, making the place feel more like home than anywhere Evelyn had ever been. She stood in the middle of the room, turned to him, and whispered, her voice fragile yet alive, "Tonight, I feel like I'm truly living again. Like everything that was ever taken from me, I finally have it back." Declan stepped closer, his gray-blue eyes reflecting the calm vastness of night. "You didn't just take it back," he said quietly. "You created something new, stronger, brighter." Evelyn looked up at him, hesitation flickering in her eyes, and then, as if a decision had quietly settled in her heart, she reached for the lapel of his jacket. "Declan," she said softly, her voice filled with trust, "I want tonight to be more than just the night I return to music. I want it to be the night I truly belong to you." Declan searched her face for a long time, as if making sure her words came from truth, not from the intoxication of applause or the lingering euphoria of the stage. When he saw the certainty in her eyes, he nodded gently and lifted her chin. "I've waited for this moment," he murmured, "but only when you were truly ready." Evelyn answered, not with words but by leaning and closing the distance between them with quiet certainty. Their kiss was not hurried nor wild. It was a slow unfolding of all the feelings that had long been waiting to find their shape. In that silence, what passed between them was not desire alone, but recognition, two souls meeting again after being lost for too long. Later, when the night grew still, they lay together in the warm light spilling through the curtains. Evelyn rested against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. Declan's arm was around her, his hand tracing slow circles across her back, the way one might touch something too precious to be real. "I love you," he whispered, voice roughened by tenderness. "Not because you're strong, not because you sing, but because of everything you are." Evelyn lifted her eyes to meet his, her own voice, trembling with truth. "And I love you." Long before I had the courage to admit it. He smiled, then one of those rare smiles that softened every edge of him. And in that quiet moment, Evelyn realized there were no walls left between them. The darkness that had once haunted them both was gone, replaced by the steady glow of something lasting. They drifted into sleep wrapped in each other's warmth, not as two broken people, but as two hearts that had finally found home. A week later, Evelyn moved into Declan's penthouse. There was no formal proposal, no long discussion. It simply happened, naturally, as if every step of their journey had been leading here. She brought a small suitcase, a few books, some clothes, and a folder of old song drafts. Declan had already made space for everything else. A place in the closet for her stage dresses, a shelf for her favorite tea, a corner of the bookcase reserved for her novels. But what touched her most were not the comforts or the grand gestures. It was the quiet ways he made this home hers, the scent of coffee every morning, the soft music playing from the wooden speaker by the window, the warmth that lingered even when he wasn't there. Living with Declan meant stepping deeper into a world he had once tried to protect her from. Some nights he came home late, his face harder, his phone filled with brief, coded conversations in Italian. Once, Evelyn overheard a few words, a warning, a name, something about cleaning up a mess. Declan never lied about his past, but he didn't explain it either. Evelyn understood. A part of him still belonged to the Shadowsa world ruled not by laws, but by loyalty and silence. Yet she also knew she could not love him by choosing only the light. She loved all of him, the man who had fought through darkness, the man who had learned to be gentle, and the man who, despite everything, still believed in redemption. And for Evelyn, that was enough. One evening, when Declan came home, late, the cuff of his white shirt still bore faint traces of dried blood. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for him with 2 cups of ginger tea. He stopped when he saw her, a flicker of caution crossing his face before he exhaled softly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I shouldn't have let you see me like this." Evelyn didn't answer right away. She poured the tea, pushed 1 cup toward him, and said quietly, "Declan, I'm not blind. I know who you are. I know what you do. I've known for a long time." Declan sank into the chair across from her, his gaze heavy. "And you're still here?" Evelyn nodded without hesitation. "Because I also know you've never used that world to hurt the innocent. I've seen the way you protect people, the way you protected me. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be real and to never push me away because you think I can't handle it." Declan was silent for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, his gray-blue eyes showing a rare, unguarded softness. "I don't deserve you." Evelyn smiled faintly, tightening her fingers around his. "But I choose you. Every day, I would still choose you." Something in Declan seemed to break open then, the walls he had spent years building collapsing under the weight of her words. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly it was as if, for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to believe he didn't have to face the darkness alone. From that night on, Evelyn knew he would never hide from her again. Whatever light or shadow his world contained, she would walk beside him through all of it. Since the day Evelyn officially moved in, Declan's penthouse had ceased to be a cold, immaculate space of glass and marble and had become a true home. She placed flowers on the dining table, framed photographs on the living room shelves, and sometimes turned the music up loud, dragging him into spontaneous dances in the kitchen, while he stumbled awkwardly through her laughter. And Declan's silent, composed, and remote began to smile more, to speak more freely when she was near. He was still Declan Hayes, the man who owned streets, the figure whose power could make half the city step aside. But at home, he was the man who took her hand in the middle of the night, who washed dishes while she hummed across the room, who rested his palm over her stomach in a long embrace and asked softly, "Are you sure you're all right?" Even when it was nothing more than a passing ache. Loving Declan never meant choosing an easy life, but it was a choice Evelyn had never once regretted. Beneath the intimidating surface was a heart fierce in its loyalty and boundless in its devotion, and within that harsh truth, she found something she once thought forever lost: peace. Not the kind that comes from a world without storms, but the kind that comes from knowing that when the storm arrives, there will always be someone standing firm, waiting for her to find her way home. On a warm afternoon in May, Declan told her that his sister would be visiting. Her name was Francesca, nearly 10 years younger than he, living in the Velvet Note with her husband and their 2 small children. Evelyn knew very little about her, only what Declan had mentioned in passing during rare conversations about his family. He had once said that Francesca was the last piece of gentleness left in his heart, the one who had always stood between him and the darkness he could never escape. When Evelyn asked why he kept his sister completely away from his work, he had simply shaken his head, his eyes distant. "Because she's the best part that's left." Evelyn understood how much this visit meant. It wasn't just a family gathering. It was a threshold, a part of Declan's world he was choosing to open to her, a deeper step into the private, unguarded self of a man she had always approached with patience, empathy, and quiet respect. Francesca arrived on a quiet weekend afternoon, carrying with her a warm smile and a sharp gaze that so clearly mirrored her brother's. She wrapped her arms around Declan the moment she stepped through the door, then turned to Evelyn with a look of kind curiosity. "You must be Evelyn," she said gently. "I've heard so much about you." Evelyn laughed, a little shy but instantly at ease with the younger woman's warmth. "I hope it was all good things." Francesca winked. "Mostly. But don't worry. I know my brother has a tendency to exaggerate when he talks about the woman he loves." Declan coughed softly behind them, and Evelyn's cheeks flushed a deep pink. Yet in that single, awkwardly tender moment, something softened between the three of them. The air grew light, easy, almost as if they had known each other for years. That afternoon they sat out on the sunlit terrace, where Evelyn often read her books in the mornings. Francesca told stories from their childhood, how Declan used to climb fences to escape school, how he threw punches at boys who mocked his sister for the limp she had been born with. Evelyn listened, occasionally glancing toward Declan, who smiled more than she had ever seen him smile, his eyes lighting up each time Francesca recalled another memory. For the first time, Evelyn didn't see the feared man whose name carried power across New Orleans. She saw a boy with scraped knuckles, who once carried his little sister to school every morning until her legs were strong enough to walk. Francesca turned to Evelyn then, her expression turning serious. "Do you know why my brother keeps you so close?" Evelyn hesitated. "Because I was attacked, and he feels responsible." Francesca shook her head. "Not just that, you calm him. My brother and I grew up in a world built on punishment, where people only believed in fear and control. But you gave him a reason to believe in something kind again. You have no idea how much you've changed him." Francesca's words left Evelyn silent. There were things she had sensed, but never allowed herself to believe. She looked at Declan holding his cup of tea, the late afternoon light tracing his face strong, yet touched by a rare vulnerability. Her heart ached with affection. After dinner, when the house was quiet and Francesca had retired to her room, Declan came up behind Evelyn in the kitchen, wrapping his arms around her waist. His voice was soft against her ear. "Thank you for accepting even the parts of me I wish I could forget." Evelyn turned in his embrace, placing a hand on his cheek. "I love all the things that make you who you are, even the ones you can't put into words." Declan exhaled slowly, tightening his hold on her, as though in her arms he had finally found a place where peace could rest. Later that night, before leaving for her hotel, Francesca hugged Evelyn for a long moment. "You know," she whispered, "this is the first time in years I've seen my brother truly happy. Please, don't ever let him be alone again." Evelyn's throat tightened. "And you don't let him forget that he still has you, the part of him that's good and whole." Francesca smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Always." In that brief embrace, Evelyn felt more than acceptance. She felt belonging. Francesca wasn't just welcoming her as Declan's partner, but as family. It was a bond deeper than words. And to Evelyn, it meant more than all the glittering lights of the stage outside their window. A week after Francesca returned to the Velvet Note, the penthouse fell quiet again. But it was not an empty quiet, it was the kind that hums softly between two people who have long grown used to each other's presence. Evelyn often sat by the window, singing to herself, her leg resting on a wooden stool that Declan had padded with a cushion for her comfort. And Declan, no matter how many meetings or calls filled his day, was always home by dinner, always there to listen as she recounted the smallest details of her day. Some evenings he spoke little, others he simply watched her with that faint smile that told her everything she needed to know, that for a man like him, this peace was love in its purest form. One early summer evening, as the scent of jasmine drifted through the open windows, Declan called her into the living room. The old piano, usually kept closed, gleamed under the soft lamplight, freshly polished. Evelyn frowned in surprise. "What's all this?" she asked, half laughing. Declan only smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that always made her heart tremble. He took her hand, led her to the long bench, and gently guided her to sit. Then, without a word, he lifted the piano lid. Francesca arrived on a quiet weekend afternoon, carrying with her a warm smile and a sharp, knowing gaze that reminded Evelyn instantly of Declan. She threw her arms around her brother the moment she stepped inside, then turned to Evelyn with a look of gentle affection. "You must be Evelyn," she said softly. "I've heard so much about you." Evelyn laughed, a little embarrassed yet grateful for the warmth in her tone. "I hope it was all good things." Francesca winked playfully. "Mostly, but don't worry, I know Declan has a habit of exaggerating when he talks about the woman he loves." Behind her, Declan gave a quiet cough, and Evelyn's cheeks flushed pink. Yet in that brief, awkward exchange, the air between the three of them lightened, easy and natural, as though they had known one another for years. They spent the afternoon out on the sun-drenched balcony where Evelyn liked to read in the mornings. Francesca told stories about their childhood, how Declan used to climb fences to sneak out of school, how he'd ball his fists and fight anyone who teased his little sister for the limp she'd been born with. Evelyn listened, glancing at Declan now and then, catching the rare brightness in his eyes each time Francesca mentioned a memory. For the first time, Evelyn didn't see the powerful man whose name made people step aside. She saw the boy who had once carried his sister on his back every morning until her legs grew strong enough to walk on their own. Then Francesca turned to her, her tone gentle but serious. "Do you know why my brother keeps you close?" Evelyn hesitated. "Because I was attacked, and he feels responsible." Francesca shook her head. "It's more than that. You soften him. My brother and I grew up in a world built on punishment, a world where people believed only in fear and power. But you gave him a reason to believe in kindness again. You have no idea how much you've changed him." Francesca's words left Evelyn quiet. She had felt traces of that truth before, but never allowed herself to believe it fully. She looked at Declan, who sat holding a teacup, the last light of day brushing across his face, strong, yet touched by a rare and fragile tenderness. Her heart tightened with love. After dinner, when the house was quiet and Francesca had gone to rest, Declan came up behind her in the kitchen and wrapped his arms around her waist. His voice was low against her ear. "Thank you for accepting even the parts of me that I find hard to face." Evelyn turned to him, placing a hand on his cheek. "I love everything that makes you who you are, even the things you can't bring yourself to say." Declan exhaled slowly, pulling her closer, as though in her arms he had finally found the one place peace could stay. Later that night, before leaving for her hotel, Francesca hugged Evelyn tightly. "You know," she whispered, "this is the first time in years I've seen my brother truly happy. Don't ever let him be alone again." Evelyn's eyes stung with tears. "And you don't let him forget that he still has you, the part of him that's good and unbroken." Francesca smiled, her eyes glistening. "Always." In that moment, Evelyn felt something more than acceptance. She felt family. Francesca wasn't simply welcoming her as Declan's partner, but as someone who now belonged to their world in the truest sense. And for Evelyn, that meant more than all the dazzling lights of the stage beyond their windows. A week after Francesca returned to the Velvet Note, the penthouse settled into quiet again, but not the cold, echoing quiet of before. It was the warm stillness of two lives intertwined. Evelyn often sang softly by the window, her leg resting on a wooden chair that Declan had padded with a small cushion for her comfort. Declan, no matter how many calls or meetings his day demanded, always returned home in time for dinner. Some evenings he spoke little. Some nights he simply watched her and smiled, and Evelyn knew that for this man, peace itself was his way of loving her. One early summer evening, with the scent of jasmine drifting through the open windows, Declan called her into the living room. The old piano, usually kept closed, gleamed under the light as though newly awakened. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "What's going on?" she asked, half laughing. Declan only smiled, a secret glimmer in his eyes. He took her hand, led her toward the long bench, and gently guided her to sit. Then, without saying a word, he lifted the lid. "I haven't played in a very long time," Declan said softly, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the black and white keys before him. "Since my mother died, I haven't touched it. I thought that if I stopped hearing its sound, I might stop remembering. But you've made me want to remember again, to bring back the parts of life that were still beautiful." Evelyn said nothing. Declan began to play, slowly, the melody of The Way You Look Tonight, drifting through the room, tender, familiar, and filled with emotion. Evelyn froze. It was the song she had once sung on a night almost lost to time, after a performance at the Velvet Note, when Declan had sat quietly in the last row. She had thought he hadn't noticed, that he hadn't been listening. But now, every note under his fingers told her otherwise. He had heard it all. He had remembered everything, even the things she never said aloud. When the final chord faded, Declan turned toward her. There were no roses, no stage, lights only, the golden glow from the lamp above, and the sound of Evelyn's heart beating in her chest. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a simple, elegant ring, the diamond modest in size but luminous under the soft light. "I don't know how to make a grand speech," he said, his voice roughened by emotion. "But I know this. I don't want to live another day without you by my side. Evelyn, will you be the woman I call my wife?" For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. Her throat closed, her eyes flooded before she even realized she was crying. She covered her mouth, nodding quickly, her tears glistening like glass. Declan smiled thin, a quiet, gentle smile unlike anything she had ever seen on his face. He slipped the ring onto her finger, lifted her hand, and kissed it softly before drawing her into his arms. They stayed that way for a long time, saying nothing. Evelyn rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, and felt that the world beyond these walls had ceased to matter. "I used to think I'd live my whole life alone," she whispered. "That no one could ever touch the pain in me and turn it into something beautiful. But you did. You didn't erase my scars, you just made them less frightening." Declan held her tighter, his voice a breath against her ear. "Because you are the only thing in this world that makes me want to be better. Not out of duty, but out of love." Evelyn lifted her gaze to him, his eyes steady, kind, and filled with a quiet vulnerability. "I love you too," she said, and for the first time the words came without hesitation or fear. Loving Declan Hayes meant embracing both his light and his shadow. But under the warm glow of that lamp, with the faint echo of music still lingering in the air, she knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen right. That simple, unadorned proposal was the most profound promise she had ever been given. Their wedding took place on a gentle autumn morning, beneath a small white archway draped with flowers in the garden behind an old chapel on the outskirts of New Orleans. Evelyn wore a simple silk gown that traced her figure gracefully, no long train, no veil, just the soft shimmer of fabric and the quiet radiance in her eyes. Declan waited for her at the steps, tall and composed in a perfectly tailored black suit, a gray tie at his collar, his gaze proud yet tender as she walked toward him. They hadn't invited many people, only those who truly mattered. Francesca flew in from New York and ran straight into Evelyn's arms when she arrived. Owen and a few trusted staff members from the Velvet Note stood in a neat row behind Declan, their suits crisp, their expressions loyal and calm. The officiating priest, an elderly man with white hair and a kind smile, was the same who had baptized Francesca years ago. No one spoke that morning of Declan Hayes' reputation, or the whispers that followed his name through the city. No one mentioned the phone calls that had gone unanswered or the people who had vanished quietly from New Orleans. On that day, none of it existed. He was simply a groom, a man who loved a woman with all that he was. And that, for everyone who stood there watching, was enough. When Evelyn reached him, Declan extended his hand and took hers with the tenderness of a man who once believed he would never again be allowed to hold something beautiful. She smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd never wear a wedding dress." Declan lowered his head, brushing his lips against the back of her hand. "And I thought I'd never love anyone this way." The vows were spoken into the still air, carried only by the soft rustle of leaves and the faint birdsong drifting from afar. When the priest asked Declan if he promised to love and protect Evelyn through every season, in storm or in calm, he did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. "I do, with everything I have." And when it was Evelyn's turn, she looked straight into his eyes, her fingers tightening around his. "I do. And I never want to be anywhere but beside you." The kiss that followed was gentle yet deep, like the meeting of two souls who had waited their whole lives for this single breath in time. Applause rippled softly through the small gathering, not loud, but full of sincerity. No music played, only the sounds of wind, of laughter, of pure human emotion filling the garden like light. The reception took place right there under the trees. A long table draped in white linen stretched across the grass, glass jars filled with fresh flowers, and ruby wine catching the late afternoon sun. Evelyn sat beside Declan, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, while Francesca told stories from their wild college years that made her laugh until tears shone in her eyes. Even Owen, usually solemn, drank more than one glass and gave a toast in a hoarse, emotional voice. Declan's sister hugged Evelyn tightly, calling her sister-in-law and the woman who brought back a man I thought the world had taken from me. In that moment, Evelyn looked at the man beside her, the one who had walked out of the shadows carrying all the gray shades of a life that had never been simple. Yet that afternoon, sunlight reflected in his eyes, and she knew those shades were no longer threatening. They had become the canvas for new colors, the hues of happiness. As the sun began to set, Declan took Evelyn's hand and led. her down the stone path through the garden, where strings of golden lights flickered to life above them. He didn't speak. He simply held her hand, squeezing gently from time to time as if to make sure she was real, still there, still his. Evelyn smiled and placed her palm against his chest, feeling the heartbeat that had once been iron now beating softly for her. It wasn't a grand wedding in a castle or a dazzling ceremony beneath crystal chandeliers. It was a union built from two people who had known fear, who had been broken, who once thought they would live out their days alone. And as they exchanged their vows beneath the open sky, Evelyn understood that she hadn't just married a man. She had found a home for her soul. 1 year after the wedding, the name Evelyn Hayes had become a quiet phenomenon in the New Orleans jazz scene. Her nights at the Velvet Note were now only the prologue to a story that stretched far beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. She had signed with a respected independent label and released her debut album of 12 songs, mostly ballads she had written herself, drawn from the memories that had once scarred and shaped her. The album, titled The One Who Heard Me, was nominated for a major music award within months. Critics described her voice as haunting and timeless, carrying within it the soul of an old city reborn. That night, under the glittering lights of a grand downtown theater, Evelyn stood on stage holding the microphone, her gaze drifting toward the front row, where Declan sat in his familiar seat, the same one he had chosen since her very first performance. The spotlight caught her face, tracing the soft lines of her features, illuminating the quiet shimmer in her eyes. Her sapphire blue gown hugged her slender frame, and the heels she wore made her seem taller, more poised, each step deliberate as though every movement was a silent declaration. She was no longer the girl left bleeding in a dark alley. She was a woman who had turned her pain into light. When the first note rose into the air, the audience fell utterly silent. Evelyn began to sing a song she had written during her earliest days of recovery, when she still lay in Declan's living room, her body marked by pain that had not yet faded. The lyrics told the story of a woman who no longer believed in miracles until someone appeared. Not an angel with wings, but a man whose gentle hands wrapped around her and sheltered her in the middle of hell itself. Evelyn's voice that night wasn't simply for the audience. It was for herself, for Declan, for the broken pieces of the past that had somehow led her here. Thunderous applause followed every song, but Evelyn heard only one thing: the steady rhythm of the man's heartbeat in the front row, and the unwavering gaze that had never left her from the moment she stepped onto the stage. After the performance, the backstage corridors filled with producers, managers, journalists, and veteran musicians eager to shake her hand, to schedule interviews, to talk about contracts. Yet Evelyn searched for only one person. And then he appeared, Declan, in a dark, tailored suit, his expression calm, but his eyes burning with pride. He didn't speak right away. He simply opened his arms, and Evelyn moved toward him instinctively, burying her face against his chest, as if all that had just happened had been a dream she needed to awaken from through the warmth of his heartbeat. "Do you see?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I did it, not only from joy, but from the quiet truth that without him, she never could have stood there." Declan's embrace tightened. He kissed the top of her head and murmured, "I never doubted it. You were born to stand beneath the lights, and I was born to sit in the first row, watching you shine." That night, they skipped the after-party. They went home to the penthouse that now held their wedding photograph framed in the living room. Evelyn, changed out of her performance gown, slipped into a soft sweater, and sat at the piano, her fingers brushing the familiar keys. Declan poured 2 glasses of wine, handed her one, then sat beside her in silence as she played a fragment of a melody still unfinished. They didn't need words. The quiet between them was not empty, it was complete, the perfect rest between 2 notes that finally belonged to the same song. On stage, Evelyn Hayes was a star reborn. But in that room, she was simply a woman who loved a man with everything she had and was loved back in a way the world could never quite understand. The grand performances would continue, her name would travel farther, but she knew that no glory could ever outshine that first night she dared to sing again, when Declan had sat beneath the lights. His hand pressed over his heart, his eyes shining with belief. That look had carried her here, and no matter how large the stage, she would always sing for him. 2 years after the cold alleyway that had once defined her fate, Evelyn Hayes stood by the wide windows of their sunlit penthouse, watching New Orleans sink gently into evening. Streetlights flickered on, car horns echoed faintly below. Each sound, Each light carried a whisper of the life she had once lived, a life that felt distant now, though in truth it had only been the blink of an eye. Behind her, Declan sat in an armchair, reading that morning's newspaper, her name printed boldly across the front page. Yet what filled him with pride wasn't the headlines or the praise. It was the woman standing there, the woman who had once fallen, who had once feared, who had once lost her voice, and who had risen again, step by step, note by note, breath by breath, until she could once more stand in the light. Evelyn turned to him, her eyes filled with something deeper than love. She crossed the room, sat beside him, and took his hand. "I was just thinking," she murmured, "about everything we've been through." Declan looked at her for a long time, his gaze no longer carrying the chill the world associated with his name. It was warm, tender, and full of words that didn't need to be spoken. "I used to think," Evelyn continued softly, "that I was nothing but the broken pieces of an old dream. And then you came, not as some perfect savior, but as someone who looked at the pieces and believed they could still form something beautiful." Declan nodded, his voice low. "Because I always knew you never lost your light. We just needed a chance to find it together." They fell silent for a while, until Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "We built something beautiful." And they had a home, a faith, a life neither of them had ever believed they deserved. Their love had not begun in perfection, but in pain in choosing not to abandon each other when everything seemed shattered. What they had built could not be measured by wealth or defined by simple words. It was redemption, it was healing, it was family. The story of Evelyn and Declan was not just a love song between a young singer and a man once feared. It was proof that even in the darkest night, sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to walk away to keep the light alive. Life will always bring loss, moments that make us want to surrender. But what matters most is whether we still have the courage to open our heartstone, let someone in to believe, once more, that love can heal. And sometimes, the most beautiful thing we ever find is not at the peak of triumph, but in the quiet place where pain once lived. Dear listeners, the story of Evelyn and Declan has touched millions because it speaks a simple truth, that love can begin in the ruins and still save what seemed beyond repair. And you? After hearing their story, what stirred in your heart? Have you ever stood in the dark, waiting for someone to reach for your hand and whisper, "I'm here, you're not alone"? Tell us your story in the comments below. Share your thoughts with us so that we and everyone listening can reflect, understand, and feel together. If this story has touched you, if you wish to keep hearing heartfelt journeys and healing stories filled with humanity, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with those you love. Every single subscription, every single share, is what keeps us inspired to continue spreading kindness and compassion to more people around the world. Thank you for spending your precious time listening to this emotional journey in its entirety. We hope you'll stay with us for the next videos, stories that reach deep into the heart and remind us of the beauty still left in this world. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, peace, and joy in every day. Goodbye for now and see you in the next story.